Welcome back. This is episode 2, and today we're diving into the next chapter. Chapter 2, The New Knowledge. As a professor of psycholinguistics in Paris and author of several highly regarded papers and books, Dr. Alfred Tomatis knows the value of scientific data as well as anyone, but he also knows that sometimes a story can make a point more effectively and simply than a dozen studies. So when he wants to illustrate the shaping power of prenatal experiences, he often tells the story of Odile, an autistic child he treated several years ago. Like most youngsters with her affliction, Odile was virtually mute. When Dr. Tomatis first saw her in his office, she neither spoke nor appeared to hear when spoken to. At first, Odile clung stubbornly to her silence. But slowly, Dr. Tomatis' treatment began drawing her out. Within a month, she was listening and speaking. Naturally, her parents were pleased with this progress. At the same time, they were also perplexed by it. They noticed their daughter's comprehension improved markedly whenever they spoke English instead of French. What perplexed them was where Odile had picked up her knowledge. Neither of them spoke much English at home, and until she came under Dr. Tomatis' care, 4-year-old Odile had been almost totally impervious to the spoken word, no matter in what language it was uttered, even assuming the unlikely that she had somehow learned it by overhearing snippets of her parents' conversations. Why hadn't any of her older and normal brothers and sisters done so as well? Initially, Dr. Tomatis found all this equally baffling, until one day when Odile's mother casually mentioned that through most of her pregnancy, she had worked in a Paris import-export firm where only English was spoken. The realization that even the rudiments of a language may be laid down in the womb has taken us full circle. 40 years ago, such a notion would have been dismissed as impossible, while 400 years ago, it would have been accepted as a matter of fact. Our ancestors were well aware that a mother's experience impressed itself on her unborn child. That's why the Chinese established the first prenatal clinics 1,000 years ago. It's also why even the most primitive cultures have had strictures warning pregnant women away from frightening events, such as fires. Centuries of observation had shown them the powerful effects of maternal anxiety and fear. References to these prenatal influences can be found in many ancient texts, from Hippocrates' journals to the Bible. In one graphic passage from St. Luke, Luke 1:44, for instance, Elizabeth exclaims, "For lo, as soon as the voice of salutation sounded in my ears, the babe in my womb leaped for joy." The first man to grasp the idea in all its dimensions, however, was neither a saint nor a physician, but the great Italian artist, inventor, and genius, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo's Quaderni has more to say about prenatal influences than many of the most modern medical texts. In one especially insightful passage, he wrote, "The same soul governs the two bodies. The things desired by the mother are often found impressed on the child, which the mother carries at the time of desire. One fear that a mother has, or mental pain, has more power over the child than over the mother, since frequently the child loses its life thereby." The rest of us needed 4 centuries and help from another genius to catch up with Leonardo. In the 18th century, man began his long, torturous love affair with the machine, and the effects were felt everywhere, including medicine. Doctors looked at the human body pretty much the way children now look at erector sets. Illness was simply a matter of finding out why what was supposed to go there didn't. What mattered was what could be immediately seen, touched, and verified. All this was laudable, up to a point. It rid medicine of the superstition that had encumbered it for the preceding 2,000 years and put it on a more rigorous, more scientific footing. But in the process, physicians became almost irrationally suspicious of things that could not be weighed, measured, or slid under a microscope. Feelings and emotions were too shadowy, too elusive, and quite irrelevant to this rational new world of precision medicine. In the early part of this century, however, many of these imprecise elements were reintroduced into medicine via the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud. Freud's work touched only briefly on the unborn child. Traditional neurological and biological opinion in his day held that a child was not mature enough to feel or experience meaningfully until the 2nd or 3rd year of life, which is why he too thought that personality did not begin until then. But Freud did make one major, if inadvertent, contribution to prenatal psychology. He established beyond all doubt that negative emotions and feelings adversely affect physical health. He called this notion psychosomatic disease, that the diseases he had in mind when he formulated the concept were ulcers and migraine headaches made little difference. Nor does the fact that he was focusing on the negative rather than the positive effects of the mind on health. The central thing was his realization that an emotion could create pain and even physical change in the body. If that was true, some researchers believed, then couldn't an emotion also shape an unborn child's personality? By the 1940s and 50s, investigators including Igor Caruso and Sepp Schindler of the University of Salzburg, Austria, Lester Sonntag and Peter Fodor of the United States, Friedrich Kruse of Germany, Dennis Stott of the University of Glasgow, D.W. Winnicott of the University of London, and Gustav Hans Graber of Switzerland were sure maternal emotions did just that to a fetus. But they could not prove it in a laboratory. As psychiatrists and psychoanalysts, their only tools were their ideas and insights. And if, by the 1950s, they had already flown higher on the wings of those ideas than they had dreamed possible when they began their research, what they still needed was a way of translating those ideas into hard, provable facts that could be verified by their colleagues in the physiological sciences. In short, what they needed was a way of actually studying and testing the unborn child in utero. That was beyond the powers of any machine or device then in existence. By the mid-60s, however, medical technology finally caught up with them. And since many of these pioneers lived on to a venerable and vigorous old age, and some are still very much alive, they had the satisfaction of seeing much of their work confirmed by a new generation of researchers. The work of such neurologists as Dominic Purpura of Albert Einstein Medical College in New York City, and Maria Zeid Salam and Richard D. Adams of Harvard, of such audiologists as Eric Wiedenberg of Sweden's Karolinska Research Institute, and such obstetricians as Antonio J. Ferreira of the Mental Research Institute at Palo Alto, and Dr. Albert Liley of the Postgraduate School National Women's Hospital in Auckland, New Zealand, and Dr. Margaret Liley, his wife, at last provided what had been so sorely lacking: hard, incontestable physiological evidence that the fetus is a hearing, sensing, feeling being. And the unborn child who began emerging from the work of these men and women was emotionally, intellectually, and physically even more advanced than the pioneers like Winnicott and Kruse had imagined. By his 5th week, for example, studies show that he is already developing an amazingly complex repertoire of reflex actions. By the 8th week, he is not only moving his head, arms, and trunk easily, he has already fashioned these movements into a primitive body language, expressing his likes and dislikes with well-placed jerks and kicks. What he especially does not like is being poked at. Push, poke, or pinch a mother's stomach, and her 2.5-month-old fetus will quickly squirm away, as observed through various techniques. This concern with comfort may explain why some newborn children are so active at night. In utero, night was a baby's busiest time of day. Lying in bed, his mother was anything but relaxed and restful. With her heartburn, upset stomach, and leg cramps, she was forever moving this way, then that way, and invariably there were at least 2 or 3 trips to the bathroom. So I do not think it is too surprising that some infants come into the world with an inverted sleep rhythm. Facial expressions take a little longer than general body movements to master. By his 4th month, the unborn child can frown, squint, and grimace. He acquires his basic reflexes at about this time too. Stroke his eyelids, done experimentally in utero, and he squints instead of jerking his entire body back as he did earlier. Stroke his lips, and he starts sucking. 4 to 8 weeks later, he is as sensitive to touch as any 1-year-old. If his scalp is accidentally tickled during a medical examination, he quickly moves his head. He also vehemently dislikes cold water. If it is injected into his mother's stomach, he kicks violently. Perhaps the most surprising thing about this thoroughly surprising creature is his discriminating tastes. We do not usually think of the fetus as a gourmet, but he is one, of sorts. Add saccharin to his normally bland diet of amniotic fluid, and his swallowing rate doubles. Add a foul-tasting iodine-like oil called Lipidol, and these rates not only drop sharply, but he also grimaces. Recent studies also show that from the 24th week on, the unborn child listens all the time, and he has a lot to listen to. The pregnant abdomen and uterus are very noisy places. His mother's stomach rumblings are the loudest sounds he hears. Her voice, his father's voice, and other occasional noises are quieter but still audible to him. The sound that dominates his world, though, is the rhythmic thump of the maternal heartbeat. As long as it is at his regular rhythm, the unborn knows all is well. He feels secure, and that sense of security stays with him. The unconscious memory of the maternal heartbeat in utero appears to be why a baby is comforted by being held to someone's chest or is lulled to sleep by the steady ticking of a clock, and why adults in a busy office are rarely distracted by the rhythmic clacking of typewriters or the steady hum of an air conditioner. Dr. Albert Liley believes it is also why most people, when asked to set a metronome to a rate that satisfies them, usually choose a rate in the range of 50 to 90 beats per minute, roughly the same as the beat of the human heart. Another expert, Elias Carnetti, thinks the primal memory of one's mother's heartbeat also explains a lot about our musical tastes. All known drum rhythms, he points out, conform to one of two basic patterns, either the rapid tattoo of animal hooves or the measured beat of the human heart. The animal hoof pattern is easy enough to understand, a distant remnant of man's past as a hunter. Yet it is the heartbeat rhythm that is more widespread in the world, even among the remaining hunting cultures. Certainly, Boris Brott is convinced his musical interests were awakened in the womb. Many other musicians, among them Arthur Rubinstein and Yehudi Menuhin, make the same claim. Moreover, in an arresting series of new studies, audiologist Michelle Clements has shown that the unborn child has distinct musical likes and dislikes, and discriminating ones at that. As I mentioned earlier, Vivaldi is one of the unborn child's favorite composers. Mozart is another. Whenever one of their soaring compositions was put on a record player, report Dr. Clements, fetal heart rate invariably steadied and kicking declined. The music of Brahms and Beethoven, and all forms of rock, on the other hand, drove most fetuses to distraction. They kicked violently when records of these composers were played to their pregnant mothers. In the 1920s, a German investigator reported an even sharper reaction. Several of his pregnant patients told him they had given up concert going because their unborn children reacted so stormily to music. Nearly 50 years later, Dr. Liley and his colleagues finally discovered why. The Liley team found that from the 25th week on, a fetus will literally jump in rhythm to the beat of an orchestra drum, which is certainly not a very restful way to spend an evening. An unborn child's vision develops more slowly, for obvious reasons. A womb, although not totally dark, is not exactly the ideal place to practice seeing. That doesn't mean a fetus can't see. From the 16th week in utero, he is very sensitive to light. He can tell when his mother is sunbathing from the rays that reach him, and while that usually does not disturb him, shining a light directly on his mother's stomach does. He often looks the other way, and even if he does not, the light startles him. One researcher produced dramatic fluctuations in fetal heartbeat just by shining a blinking light on a pregnant woman's stomach. A child's vision is not particularly acute at birth. A newborn has only 2,500 vision, which means he cannot see a tree half a football field away. But neither trees nor football fields have much to do with his life at this point anyway. He can see the objects in his world fairly clearly if they are up close. He can make out most of the features of his mother's face if they are 6 to 12 inches away. Equally impressive, from as far away as 9 feet, he can spot the outline of a finger. Dr. Liley has a fascinating theory about this. He believes a baby's visual shortcomings may, at least in part, be the after effects of a habit he picked up in the womb. He argues that if an infant is not much interested in objects more than a foot to a foot and a half away, it is because that distance corresponds to the size of the home he has recently vacated. The fact that the unborn child has proven abilities to react to his surroundings through his senses shows that he has the basic prerequisites for learning. Personality formation requires something more, however. At an absolute minimum, it requires consciousness or awareness. A mother's thoughts and feelings cannot register in a void if they are to be meaningful. Her child has to be acutely aware of what she is thinking and experiencing. Just as essential, he has to be able to read her thoughts and feelings with some subtlety and sophistication. He gets a lot of messages in the womb, and he has to be able to tell which are essential and which are not, which messages to act on and which to disregard. Finally, he has to remember what they tell him. If he can't, their content, no matter how critical, will not register for more than a moment or two. This is a great deal to ask of a very small child, which is why some investigators still vigorously resist the notion that personality begins forming in utero. They argue that the emotional, intellectual, and neurological capacities involved in this complex process are far beyond the unborn child's capabilities. These objections, however, blindly ignore what has been learned in the laboratory. Recent neurological studies not only prove that consciousness, the most important of the three prerequisites, exists in utero, but pinpoint the time it begins. Dr. Dominic Purpura, editor of the highly respected journal Brain Research, professor at Albert Einstein Medical College, and head of the study section on the brain of the National Institutes of Health, puts the start of awareness between the 28th and 32nd week. By this point, he notes, the brain's neural circuits are just as advanced as a newborn's. This is critical because messages are relayed across the brain and from the brain to various parts of the body through those circuits. At about the same time, the cerebral cortex matures enough to support consciousness. This is equally important because the cortex is the highest, most complex part of the brain, the part most distinctly human. It is what we use for thinking, feeling, and remembering. A few weeks later, brainwaves become distinct, making it easy to distinguish between the child's sleeping and waking states. Even asleep, he is mentally active now. From the 32nd week on, brainwave tests begin picking up periods of REM sleep, which in adults signify the presence of dream states. And while it is impossible to say whether fetal REMs signify the same thing, if the child does dream, I suspect his dreams would not be very different from ours. He may dream of moving his hands and feet, for instance, or of hearing noises. He may even be able to tune into the thoughts or dreams of his mother, so that her dreams become his dreams. Another possibility suggested by 3 American sleep researchers, Drs. H.P. Rufor, J.H. Musil, and W.C. Dement, is that the REM periods are the fetal brain's equivalent of weightlifting. To develop properly, they argue, it has to exercise itself, and the neurological activity of REM periods is just that, mental exercise. The first thin slivers of memory track begin streaking across the fetal brain sometime in the 3rd trimester, though exactly when is hard to pinpoint. Some investigators claim a child can remember from the 6th month on. Others argue the brain does not acquire powers of recall until at least the 8th month. There is, however, no question that the unborn child remembers or that he retains his memories. In a recent book, Czechoslovakian psychiatrist Stanislav Grof tells how one man under medication portrayed his fetal body very accurately, how large his head was in comparison to his legs and arms, what it felt like to be warm amniotic fluid, and to be attached to his placenta. Then, while describing his heart sounds and those of his mother, he suddenly broke off midway and announced he could hear muffled noises outside the womb, the laughter and yelling of human voices, and the tinny blast of carnival trumpets. Just as suddenly and inexplicably, the man declared he was about to be delivered. Intrigued by the vividness and detail of his memory, Dr. Groff contacted the patient's mother, who not only confirmed the details of her son's story, but added that it was the excitement of a carnival that precipitated his birth. Still, the woman was surprised by Dr. Groff's query. She had deliberately kept her visit to the carnival secret all these years because she had been warned by her mother that such a thing might happen if she went. How, she wondered, had the doctor learned of her visit? Whenever I include this story in a lecture, lay people invariably nod their heads knowingly. The notion that an unborn child remembers strikes them as quite natural. The same is true of fetal consciousness. Most people find it a perfectly logical idea, especially women who are or were pregnant. What does provoke puzzled looks and questions from audiences, though, is the claim that an unborn child can sense his mother's thoughts and feelings. How, people ask, can a child decode maternal messages that say love and comfort when he has absolutely no way of knowing what these feeling states mean? The first glimmerings of answer to that question came in 1925, when American biologist and psychologist W.B. Cannon demonstrated that fear and anxiety can be biochemically induced by the injection of a group of chemicals called catecholamines, which appear naturally in the blood of fearful animals and humans. In Dr. Cannon's experiments, the catecholamines extracted from already frightened animals were injected into a second group of relaxed animals. Within seconds and without provocation, all the calm animals also began acting terrified. Dr. Cannon subsequently discovered that what produced this unusual effect was the catecholamines' ability to act like a circulating fire alarm system. Once in the bloodstream, they produce all the physiological reactions we associate with fear and anxiety. And whether the blood system happens to be in an animal or unborn child makes little difference. The only distinction in the fetus's case is the source of these substances. They come from his mother when she becomes upset. As soon as they pass the placental barrier, they upset him as well. Strictly speaking, that makes the unborn child's anxiety and fear largely physiological. The direct, immediate, and most measurable impact on maternal hormones is on his body, not his mind. But in the process, these substances do begin prodding him toward a primitive awareness of himself and of the purely emotional side of feeling states. This is a complicated process, and we will take a closer look at how it occurs in the next chapter. Suffice it to say here that each wave of maternal hormones jolts him out of the blankness that is his normal state in the womb and into a kind of receptivity. Something unusual, perhaps unsettling, has happened, and because he is human, the fetus begins trying to make sense out of that event. Though he does not frame the question quite this way, what he is really asking himself is why. Gradually, as his brain and nervous system mature, he will begin finding answers, not just in the physical side of his mother's feeling states, but in the emotional side as well. This process is not as concrete as words make it sound, but by the 6th or 7th month, an unborn baby is capable of making some fairly subtle discrimination in his mother's attitudes and feelings, and, more importantly, starts acting on them. One of the best demonstrations of this fact I know of is a remarkable series of studies reported by Dr. Dennis Stott in the early 1970s. Given the obvious communication problems, an unborn or newly born child cannot tell us what maternal feelings he sensed in utero or how he reacted to them, but like the rest of us, he is subject to the psychosomatic effect. When he is happy, he often blossoms physically. When he is distraught, he just as often becomes sickly and emotionally unstable. And since the chief source of his emotional life in utero is his mother, Dr. Stott reasoned that a child's physical and emotional state at birth, and in the years immediately following it, would provide a good idea of the kind of maternal messages he received in utero, and how accurately he perceived them. If he was right, then short-term maternal upsets should not affect a child as deeply as long-term ones. And that is what he found in one of his studies. No ill effects, physical or emotional, were apparent in the offspring of women who had suffered fairly intense but brief stress during pregnancy, such as witnessing a violent dogfight, suffering a scare at work, or having a child of hers run away for a day. Of course, one might argue that since such frights were short-lived, perhaps the relatively brief exposure to maternal hormones did not harm their children's emotional and physical health. But by that logic, all the babies in the study exposed to intense, long-term stresses should have been born sickly. They were not, however. In fact, a very fine discrimination among stresses emerged. Dr. Stott's data showed that prolonged upsets that did not directly threaten a woman's emotional security, such as the illness of a close relative, had little or no effect on her unborn child, while long-term personal stresses frequently did. More often than not, these were created by tension with a close family member, usually a husband, but in some instances an in-law. According to Dr. Stott, aside from being personal, two other things characterize these stresses. They tended to be continuous or liable to erupt at any time, and they were incapable of resolution. The fact that 10 of the 14 women in the study subjected to these stresses bore children with physical or emotional problems seems to me to go beyond anything that can be explained purely in physiological terms. After all, this and the other type of long-term stresses he studied were both intense, hence equally able to release large amounts of maternal hormones into the bloodstream. The only way to make sense of the difference is in terms of perception. In one case, the children were able to sense that while very real, their mother's distress was not threatening to her or them. In the other case, they sensed accurately that her distress was a threat. Unfortunately, one of the things Dr. Stott did not look at in his study is the way the personal stress mothers felt about their unborn children. If he had, I suspect, he would have found that the intensity of a woman's feeling toward her child can lessen the impact her upsets have on him. Her love is what matters most. And when her child senses that love, it forms a kind of protective shield around him that may decrease or in some cases neutralize the impact of outside tensions. It would be hard to imagine a more tumultuous pregnancy than the one a woman I'll call Susan endured. Husbandless, her spouse left her a few weeks after she learned she was expecting, and beset by constant financial problems, Susan had already encountered more than her share of difficulties when, in her 6th month, a precancerous cyst was found on one of her ovaries. Its immediate removal was urged, but when Susan was told that the required surgery would abort her child, she refused. In her mid-30s, Susan believed this was her last opportunity to have a child, and she desperately wanted it. Nothing else mattered, she told me later. I would have risked anything to have my baby. On some level, I feel her child sensed that desire. Andrea, as the infant was named, was born healthy, and at this writing, 2 years later is a normal, happy, well-adjusted child. In short, then, while the external stresses a woman faces matter, what matters most is the way she feels about her unborn child. Her thoughts and feelings are the material out of which the unborn child fashions himself. When they are positive and nurturing, the child can, as Andrea did, withstand shocks from almost any quarter. But the fetus cannot be misled either. If he is good at sensing what is on her attitude toward him, as a group of ingeniously designed new psychological studies show. After following 2,000 women through pregnancy and birth, Dr. Monika Lukash, a psychologist at Constantine University in Frankfurt, West Germany, concluded in her study that the mother's attitude had the single greatest effect on how an infant turned out. All her subjects were from the same economic background, all were equally intelligent, and all had the same degree and quality of prenatal care. The only major distinguishing factor was their attitudes toward their unborn children, and that turned out to have a critical effect on their infants. The children of accepting mothers, who looked forward to having a family, were much healthier emotionally and physically at birth and afterward than the offspring of rejecting mothers. Dr. Gerhard Rotman of the University of Salzburg, Austria, came to the same conclusion. His study is especially noteworthy because it shows the very fine emotional distinction the fetus is capable of. His subjects, 141 women, were placed in one of 4 emotional categories based on their attitudes toward pregnancy. There were no surprises in the findings from his broad categories. They closely duplicated Dr. Lukash's results. The women Dr. Rotman labeled ideal mothers, because psychological testing showed they wanted their unborn children both consciously and unconsciously, had the easiest pregnancies, the most trouble-free births, and the healthiest offspring, physically and emotionally. The women with the negative attitudes, the ones he labeled catastrophic mothers, as a group had the most devastating medical problems during pregnancy and bore the highest rate of premature, low-weight, and emotionally disturbed infants. The most interesting data, however, came from Dr. Rotman's 2 intermediate groups. His ambivalent mothers were outwardly quite happy about their pregnancies. Husbands, friends, and families all assumed these women could not wait to be mothers. Their unborn children knew differently. Their sensors picked up the same subconscious ambivalence Dr. Rotman's psychological tests had. At birth, an unusually large number of them had both behavioral and gastrointestinal problems. The unborn children of cool mothers also appeared to be deeply confused about the mixed messages they were picking up. Their mothers had many different reasons for not wanting children. They had careers, financial problems, or were not ready to be mothers yet. But Dr. Rotman's tests showed that subconsciously they desired their pregnancies. On some level, their children picked up both messages, and it apparently confused them. At birth, an unusually large number of them were apathetic and lethargic. What about the father's influence? As I mentioned earlier, all the evidence indicates that the quality of a woman's relationship with her husband or partner, whether she feels happy and secure or alternatively ignored and threatened, has a decisive effect on her unborn child. Dr. Lukesh, for example, rates the quality of a woman's relationship to her spouse second only to her attitude toward being a mother in determining infant outcome. And as we have just seen, Dr. Stott also considers this crucial. He rates a bad marriage or relationship as among the greatest causes of emotional and physical damage in the womb. On the basis of a recent study of over 1,300 children and their families, he estimates a woman locked in a stormy marriage runs a 237% greater risk of bearing a psychologically or physically damaged child than a woman in a secure, nurturing relationship. Even such widely recognized dangers as physical illness, smoking, and the performance of backbreaking labor during pregnancy pose less of a risk to the unborn child, according to Dr. Stott. And his figures are persuasive. He found unhappy marriages produced children who as babies were 5 times more fearful and jumpy than the offspring of happy relationships. These youngsters continued to be plagued by problems well into childhood. At 4 and 5, Dr. Stott found them to be undersized, timid, and emotionally dependent on their mothers to an inordinate degree. These data are disturbing. But it is also important to remember that a strong, nurturing mother-child bond can protect the fetus against even very traumatic shocks. Moreover, there are no one-to-one correlations in human psychology. Because a child is the product of an unhappy marriage or the baby of a cool, ambivalent, or even catastrophic mother, does not necessarily mean he will develop an adult case of schizophrenia, alcoholism, promiscuity, or compulsiveness. Nothing about the mind is that neat. But the womb is the child's first world. How he experiences it, as friendly or hostile, does create personality and character predispositions. The womb, in a very real sense, establishes the child's expectations. If it has been a warm, loving environment, the child is likely to expect the outside world to be the same. This produces a predisposition toward trust, openness, extroversion, and self-confidence. The world will be his oyster, just as the womb has been. If that environment has been hostile, the child will anticipate that his new world will be equally uninviting. He will be predisposed toward suspiciousness, distrust, and introversion. Relating to others will be hard, and so will self-assertion. Life will be more difficult for him than for a child who had a good womb experience. To some extent, we can even measure these predispositions. The shyness of those toddlers who had been rated as anxious in utero is one example of prenatal characteristics that were predictive of later behavior. An even better example is a long-term study on adolescents done a few years later at the same center, the Fells Research Institute in Yellow Springs, Ohio. As might be expected, the investigators did not find a perfect correlation between the subjects' behavior as teenagers. But the relationships that did emerge were both significant and intriguing. The measuring stick, in this instance, was heart rate, which, like activity, is a good indicator of fetal personality. By monitoring it, we can determine how a particular child reacts to stress and frights. In this instance, their source was a loud noise made near their mother, and hence learn something about his personality style. What makes the Fells findings so significant is not only their demonstration that, like the rest of us, each unborn baby reacts to stress in his or her own characteristic way, but also that reaction tells us something important about a child's future personality. Take what I will call the low reactors, the fetuses who, judging by the continued steadiness of their heartbeat, were upset very little by the noise. 15 years later, these youngsters were still rarely upset by the unexpected. The researchers found that they remained in control of their emotions and behavior. In a quite different way, the same correlation was found in the teenagers who had overreacted, judged by the fluctuations in their heart rate, to the noise in utero. As a group, they were still highly emotional. These differences even showed up in the cognitive or thought styles of the two groups. When one of what I will call the high-reacting adolescents was shown a picture by the investigators, he was much more likely to provide an emotional, creative interpretation of it, describing not just what was in the picture, but how he thought the people in it felt, whether they were sad or happy, concerned or carefree. The low reactors, on the other hand, tended to offer very concrete descriptions. What they described was what they saw immediately in front of them. There was little or no imagination or flair in their interpretations. Chapter 2 is now complete. That's it for today's episode. Stay tuned for the next one. Until then, take care and see you soon. Thank you for listening.